What happens when a foreign policy doctrine, something foundational, hits its 200th birthday? And instead of, being retired, it's brought back to life and completely redefined for a world its authors could never have imagined.
That's a great way to put it.
Because that is the premise of this deep dive. We're looking at the 1823 Monroe Doctrine and its dramatic 2025 reinterpretation. It's found explicitly in the new national security strategy, a concept our sources are calling the Trump Corollary.
And we should be clear from the jump.
Yeah.
The crucial context for you to grasp here is just the magnitude of this shift. The 2025 National Security Strategy, or NSS, it represents the most significant reordering of U.S. foreign policy in, at least 5 decades.
Our mission is to trace this evolution, right? From its quiet sort of defensive beginnings to its very active global expansions, and then examine the radical changes in this new inward-facing strategy. Okay, let's unpack this.
The new mantra, according to the document itself, is stark. It's hemisphere first, world second.
That sets the stage perfectly. And to understand the gravity of that statement, we have to go back to the start, back to 1823. When President James Monroe announced this, it wasn't about projecting power.
Not at all. It was about survival.
It was about drawing a very nervous line in the sand.
Precisely. The motivation was rooted in, geopolitical fear. You have the Spanish and Portuguese empires collapsing in Latin America.
Right.
And the young United States feared that European monarchies, especially the conservative Holy Alliance, would try to reassert colonial rule. They saw that as an existential threat.
And it wasn't just an American idea, was it? We know the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, was hugely influential in drafting it.
He was the architect, really.
But the British were also kind of silent partners here. They had commercial interests in keeping other Europeans out of the Americas, so they quietly backed the doctrine.
Which is fascinating because what's key here is how simple and how purely defensive the doctrine was at its core. You really need to remember the 3 original pillars.
Okay, let's lay them out.
First, non-colonization. The Western Hemisphere was declared closed to any future European colonial claims.
Simple enough. What's number 2?
Non-interference. European powers were told, flat out, you must not meddle in the political affairs of the Americas.
And the third one, which often gets forgotten but really defined its initial modesty, was the reciprocal promise, U.S. non-intervention. The U.S. pledged to stay out of Europe's wars and politics.
Exactly. And that initial logic was perfect for a young nation. You have these wide oceans acting as giant defense buffers.
A geographic shield.
A huge one. And ideologically, it was all framed to support independence and republicanism in the new Latin American states, a clear break from the monarchies of Europe.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. For decades, the doctrine was basically a bluff. The U.S. didn't have the naval power to enforce it everywhere.
Thought in close.
But that all changed as the U.S. started actively expanding its power in the late 19th century. And that's when the doctrine went from being a shield to, a sword.
The Spanish-American War in 1898. That's the monumental turning point. The conflict was, on paper, about Cuba.
Right, preventing Spain from keeping control.
But the outcomes were what really transitioned the Monroe Doctrine from a passive defensive stance to an active interventionist, even global policy.
Absolutely. The U.S. gets Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. Cuba becomes a protectorate. Suddenly, the U.S. is a major power in the Caribbean and the Pacific.
But the real expansion of that interventionist policy, the shift from just preventing outside interference to becoming the hemisphere's self-appointed manager, that came in 1904.
The Roosevelt Corollary.
The Roosevelt Corollary.
It's kind of funny because that third original pillar, U.S. staying out of Europe, that died when the U.S. entered World War I. But the interventionist instinct in the Americas just got stronger.
It did. Theodore Roosevelt essentially grafted a new aggressive principle onto the doctrine. He claimed the U.S. had the right to intervene in Latin American nations to maintain stability and prevent chronic wrongdoing.
Which was really code for preventing European nations from using force to collect debts.
Exactly. It basically turned the U.S. into the policeman of the Western Hemisphere.
And that set a clear pattern. It justified occupations, deployments, all through the Caribbean and Central America for the next 50 years. It created this legacy of resentment that, ironically, the 2025 NSS is now trying to move past.
Now, fast forward again to the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, that crystallized the doctrine's core security rule.
Right.
That the hemisphere is a vital security zone, and a great power's military presence here is just unacceptable. The Soviet attempt to put nukes in Cuba was seen as a direct violation of that 140-year-old principle.
And that Cold War context is so vital, it intensified U.S. involvement dramatically. Under the logic of the Monroe Doctrine plus anti-communism, the U.S. intervened again and again.
Guatemala in '54.
Dominican Republic in '65, Chile in '73. All of it was aimed at stamping out perceived Soviet influence. It defined the U.S. as a global manager protecting its own turf.
After all that, after decades of managing global conflict, we jump to today. The 2025 National Security Strategy argues that global management system led directly to an unsustainable cost, overextension.
So this new NSS explicitly calls for a revival and a reinterpretation of that classic doctrine. This is the Trump corollary.
And it's defined by two key actions: prioritization and rejection. It prioritizes the Western Hemisphere above all else,
Okay.
and at the same time, it explicitly rejects the post-World War II consensus. It seeks to end the U.S. role as the global atlas, carrying the burden of the liberal international order.
And to be clear, rejecting the liberal international order is a massive philosophical break. We're talking about the system of alliances, NATO, WTO, all of it that the U.S. built and sustained since 1945.
Exactly. And this new redefinition is built on four core pillars that fall under that America First banner. And they really detail how this NSS views internal problems as being on par with historical external threats.
Okay, let's detail those. First, strong borders and migration control.
Top of the list.
Second, a severe reduction of military and economic commitments outside the hemisphere.
A big one.
Third, strengthening domestic industry and supply chains. And fourth, treating alliances as transactional, not ideological.
And that last point is so crucial. When the NSS says transactional, it means an alliance is valued purely on immediate, measurable returns. It rejects the idea that shared democratic values are enough reason for a partnership.
It's a total break from the post-war idea where collective security was the reward for shared principles.
And the internal focus is just as radical. The very definition of a security priority has changed. The 1823 doctrine worried about European ships.
Yeah.
The 2025 NSS is focused on internal vulnerabilities. Mass migration, for instance, is explicitly framed as a top-tier national security threat.
Which leads to these other new concepts like economic nationalism, reshoring supply chains, protecting U.S. workers, and this idea of cultural cohesion.
Which the NSS actually defines. It treats domestic unity and identity as a security asset.
So if you look at the definition in the document, cultural cohesion is about leveraging domestic unity to resist foreign influence and reduce internal division. It makes the state of American identity itself a strategic defense asset.
It's a profound shift.
So what does this all mean? Why this deep shift inward right now? The NSS outlines several, compelling arguments for this pivot.
The first driver is what the document calls overextension abroad. The argument is direct. Decades spent managing Middle East conflicts, bearing NATO security burdens, maintaining Asian alliances, it all undermined the nation's core strength.
The argument is that this global role degraded the economy, military readiness, and critically social cohesion at home.
And that leads directly into driver two, mass migration as a risk. The NSS points to immediate instability in our own hemisphere.
Venezuelan economic collapse, Haiti's instability, Central American climate, and gang violence, all driving mass movement.
So just as the 1823 doctrine treated European monarchies as an existential political threat, the 2025 NSS treats uncontrolled migration as an existential threat to internal stability and resources.
Then there's the geopolitical element, driver three. We're seeing renewed great power presence in the Americas, sort of echoing those old 19th century fears.
Right, and this is mainly about U.S. concerns over Chinese investments in Latin American energy, ports, digital infrastructure, plus documented Russian paramilitary activity.
And driver four is purely strategic economics. The goal is to aggressively reduce reliance on Asia for critical goods, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, critical minerals.
By strengthening supply chains within the hemisphere, it's viewed as more secure, less vulnerable to disruption.
But if you're reducing reliance on Asia by concentrating supply chains in the hemisphere, aren't you just swapping geopolitical risk in the Pacific for, say, political instability risk in Central America? Did the sources address that?
They did. The strategy argues that while risk exists, the U.S. can exert vastly more direct influence and control over supply chains here in our hemisphere than it can thousands of miles away in Asia. It makes the regional risk calculation acceptable.
And finally, driver five, the domestic political logic.
Yes. By framing cultural cohesion, workforce protection, and fewer foreign entanglements as national security priorities, the policy resonates with political coalitions that are skeptical of globalization. It makes foreign policy directly serve domestic concerns.
Okay, let's synthesize this across 200 years. Despite all these massive changes, what stays the same?
What remains is the fundamental belief that the hemisphere is the foundational security zone of the United States. That's number one.
Right.
There is also a deep, abiding suspicion of outside great powers operating in Latin America. And third, a consistent desire to project strength to prevent foreign influence close to U.S. borders. Those three things are non-negotiable across both documents.
But the key changes are truly historic. The emphasis has fundamentally moved from external threats, Europeans, Soviets, terrorists, to internal societal vulnerabilities.
Migration, culture, economic nationalism.
The U.S. is signaling a massive retreat from global commitments instead of expanding into new ones, which is what defined the doctrine for over a century.
And this is the central ideological bridge. The 1823 Monroe Doctrine aimed to protect a weak young republic from external colonial powers in Europe. The 2025 Trump Corollary, conversely, aims to protect what it calls an overstretched superpower from the financial, social, and political strain of global commitments and internal fragmentation. It's a strategy of retrenchment for resilience at home.
That comparison is the stunning insight here. The sources show us a strategy rooted in 200 years of history, but radically redefined, not just to address external powers, but to explicitly prioritize the battle against domestic strain.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to consider. If American security is now defined primarily by internal cohesion, economic nationalism, and strong borders, what's the fate of the liberal international order the U.S. created and sustained for 80 years? And if the U.S. retreats, who or what fills that global void?